disappearance of Brandon Swanson. The last words Brandon Swanson's father heard were, "Oh sh," followed by silence. It was 2:30 a.m. on May 14th, 2008, and Dan Swanson had been on the phone with his 19-year-old son for nearly 47 minutes, trying to locate him after Brandon's car went into a ditch. Despite an exhaustive search beginning that night and continuing for years afterward, Brandon Swanson was never found. Not a single trace of him. No clothing, no personal belongings, nothing that would indicate what happened after that phone call abruptly ended. What makes this case particularly baffling is that Brandon wasn't in a remote wilderness. He disappeared in rural Minnesota, in farmland divided by gravel roads, shallow ditches, and the occasional creek. This was open country where a person should be visible from considerable distance. Yet somehow, in this exposed landscape, a young man vanished completely. Tonight, we examine the known facts, the timeline of events, the extensive searches, and the theories that attempt to explain what happened to Brandon Swanson on that spring night in 2008, a night that began with celebration and ended in an enduring mystery. The last known day. Brandon Swanson had reason to celebrate on May 13th, 2008. The 19-year-old had just completed his classes at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota. Though not a formal graduation, it marked the end of his coursework in the small agricultural community. Brandon was still finding his path in life. He had struggled somewhat academically, but had recently found his footing in a wind energy program that seemed to suit him better. Friends described Brandon as friendly and sociable, someone who enjoyed spending time with others. He was of average height and build, with light brown hair and a laid-back demeanor. He lived with his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, in Marshall, Minnesota, about 30 miles east of Canby. The drive between the two towns was one Brandon had made countless times over the previous academic year. That evening, Brandon attended a small gathering with fellow students to mark the end of classes. By all accounts, it was a modest celebration. Friends later reported that while Brandon had consumed some alcohol, he wasn't heavily intoxicated. Around midnight, he decided it was time to head home to Marshall. Brandon called his parents shortly after midnight to let them know he was on his way back from Canby. The drive should have taken about 30 to 45 minutes. When he hadn't arrived by 1:15 a.m., his parents grew concerned and tried calling his cell phone. Brandon answered and explained that he'd driven his car into a ditch and was stuck. He asked if they could come pick him up. Brandon told his parents he was near Lind, a small town about 5 miles southwest of Marshall. Brian and Annette got in their vehicle and headed toward Lind, keeping Brandon on the phone to coordinate their meeting. But when they arrived at the location Brandon described, they couldn't find him. They flashed their headlights and honked their horn, but Brandon said he couldn't see or hear them. This began a puzzling back and forth. Brandon insisted he was near Lind, while his parents drove around the area seeing no sign of him or his car. After some time, Brandon became frustrated and decided to start walking toward the lights of what he believed was the town of Lind. He said he would meet his parents at a nearby bar called the Lone Tree. What Brandon's parents didn't realize yet, and what investigators would soon discover, was that Brandon wasn't near Lind at all. He had become disoriented in the dark rural landscape and was actually near Porter, Minnesota, about 25 miles north of where he thought he was. The lights he saw weren't from Lind, but likely from the much smaller town of Porter. The final call. As Brandon walked through the dark countryside, his father stayed on the phone with him. Brandon described walking through a field, occasionally mentioning landmarks like a fence line or being near what he thought was a river or creek. The night was cool, but not cold, with clear skies, typical spring weather for western Minnesota. At approximately 2:30 a.m., while still on the phone with his father, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit." Then the line went dead. Dan Swanson immediately called back, but Brandon never answered. After several attempts, the Swansons contacted the local authorities to report their son missing. This final exclamation has become the haunting centerpiece of Brandon's disappearance. What caused Brandon's alarmed reaction? Did he stumble? Did he encounter someone or something unexpected? Was he injured? These questions continue to fuel speculation and investigation into his disappearance. The initial search. Law enforcement began searching for Brandon in the early morning hours of May 14th. They first focused on the area around Lind, based on Brandon's own description of his location. But there was no sign of Brandon or his vehicle. Later that day, authorities located Brandon's car, a Chevrolet Lumina, in a ditch near Porter, Minnesota, approximately 25 miles from where Brandon thought he was. The discovery of the vehicle so far from the expected location immediately changed the search parameters. Brandon's car was found along a gravel road in a shallow ditch between two farm fields. The vehicle was intact, with no significant damage, suggesting a major accident. The keys were missing, but otherwise the car appeared normal. There were no signs of blood or struggle either in or around the vehicle. Investigators determined that Brandon had likely become disoriented after leaving Canby, possibly taking a wrong turn that led him north to Porter instead of east to Marshall. In the darkness of rural Minnesota, with few distinct landmarks visible at night, such disorientation is understandable. The gravel roads in this region can look remarkably similar, especially in the dark. With the discovery of Brandon's car, search efforts shifted to the area around Porter. Law enforcement organized search parties that included officers, volunteers, family members, and friends. They focused on the terrain where Brandon might have walked while on the phone with his father. The searchers faced several challenges. First, they were working with limited information about Brandon's exact route after leaving his car. Second, the rural landscape offered numerous hazards: creeks, drainage ditches, abandoned wells, and dense vegetation in some areas. Finally, while Brandon had described walking through fields and mentioned a fence line and possibly a river, these features were common throughout the region. Over the next several days, the search expanded. Authorities used helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, search dogs, ATVs, and teams on foot to cover the area. They searched outbuildings, abandoned structures, and water features. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Brandon was found. No clothing, no cell phone, no keys, nothing that would indicate his presence or his fate. The Yellow Medicine River factor. One geographical feature that gained particular attention was the Yellow Medicine River, which flows near where Brandon's car was found. The river isn't particularly large. In many places it's more of a creek, but in spring, after the snow melt, it can have stronger currents and deeper sections. Some investigators speculated that Brandon's final exclamation might have been the result of falling into the river. If he had been walking in the dark and accidentally stepped into the water or slipped down the bank, he could have been caught by the current or suffered an injury that prevented him from getting out. Search teams focused extensively on the river and its banks. Divers examined deeper pools, and searchers walked miles along both sides of the waterway. Despite these efforts, no evidence was found to confirm or refute the theory that Brandon had encountered the river. The Yellow Medicine River theory remains one of the most plausible explanations for Brandon's disappearance, but it also presents problems. If Brandon had drowned, searchers would likely have found his body downstream within days or weeks. Bodies in water typically surface eventually. The absence of any physical evidence, including clothing, his cell phone, or keys, makes a simple drowning scenario less convincing to many investigators. The investigation deepens. As days turned to weeks with no sign of Brandon, the investigation broadened. Authorities interviewed Brandon's friends who had been with him earlier that night, examined his cell phone records, and looked into his personal life for any clues that might explain his disappearance. Nothing suspicious emerged. Brandon had no known enemies, no significant financial troubles, and no history of depression or suicidal ideation. By all accounts, he was looking forward to his future. There was no evidence suggesting he planned to disappear voluntarily. Cell phone records confirmed the timeline of events. Brandon's last known location, based on cell tower data, placed him in the vicinity where his car was found. The phone records showed his final call with his father ended abruptly at 2:30 a.m., consistent with Dan Swanson's account. Investigators also considered whether Brandon might have encountered someone else after his car went into the ditch. Could he have been picked up by a passerby with malicious intent? While possible, there was no evidence supporting this theory. The rural roads where Brandon disappeared see very little traffic, especially in the early morning hours. No suspicious vehicles were reported in the area that night. Another angle investigators pursued was the possibility that Brandon had become disoriented due to hypothermia. Though the night wasn't extremely cold, temperatures were cool enough that prolonged exposure could lead to hypothermia, especially if Brandon had become wet crossing a creek or fell into the river. Hypothermia can cause confusion and irrational behavior, including what's known as terminal burrowing, where victims sometimes hide in enclosed spaces as their condition worsens. Search teams looked for any signs that Brandon might have sought shelter in culverts, dense brush, or outbuildings, but again found nothing. The searches continue. In the weeks and months following Brandon's disappearance, numerous organized searches were conducted. These weren't haphazard efforts. They were methodical operations involving grid searches, specialized equipment, and trained personnel. Law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions participated, as did volunteer organizations specializing in missing persons cases. Search and rescue dogs were brought in repeatedly. Areas were searched and researched as seasons changed. Vegetation died back, and new techniques became available. One of the largest searches took place in October 2008, 5 months after Brandon's disappearance. This operation involved over 200 volunteers and officers searching an expanded area around where Brandon's car was found. Again, Not a single piece of physical evidence was discovered. Brandon's parents never gave up. They continued to organize searches, work with private investigators, and keep their son's case in the public eye. Their determination led to the passage of Brandon's Law in Minnesota in 2009, which requires law enforcement to conduct immediate preliminary investigations into missing adults when the circumstances surrounding their disappearance are suspicious. As the years passed, the searches became less frequent, but didn't stop entirely. Even a decade after Brandon vanished, occasional searches were still being conducted when new information or techniques became available. Each search ended the same way, with no answers, no evidence, and no Brandon. The theories. When someone vanishes without a trace, theories inevitably emerge to fill the void of certainty. In Brandon's case, several predominant theories have been explored by investigators and the public. The first and perhaps most straightforward theory is that Brandon accidentally fell into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. The river was within walking distance of where his car was found, and his final exclamation could have been a reaction to slipping into the water. The challenge with this theory is the complete absence of physical evidence. Even if Brandon's body had been carried downstream, items like his cell phone, wallet, or clothing would likely have been found eventually. A variation of this theory suggests that Brandon may have fallen into the river, but then managed to get out, only to succumb to hypothermia elsewhere. In this scenario, he might have wandered away from the river in a confused state, perhaps eventually seeking shelter in a location that wasn't found during searches. This could potentially explain the lack of evidence in the river itself, but still raises questions about why no trace was ever found on land. Another theory involves the numerous abandoned wells and farm structures in the area. Western Minnesota's farming landscape is dotted with old, unmarked wells, some covered over with rotting wood or partially collapsed. If Brandon accidentally fell into such a well, he could have been injured or killed, with his body remaining undiscovered. Searchers did check known wells in the area, but older, undocumented ones might have been missed. Some have proposed that Brandon might have encountered someone else after his car went into the ditch. Perhaps someone who offered help, but then had malicious intentions. Without evidence of another person being in the area, this remains speculative. No suspicious vehicles or individuals were reported nearby that night, and the remote location makes a chance encounter less likely. A small minority of theorists have suggested that Brandon might have staged his disappearance to begin a new life elsewhere. This theory has little supporting evidence and contradicts what is known about Brandon's character and plans. He had no history of expressing dissatisfaction with his life, had maintained normal relationships with family and friends, and hadn't withdrawn money or made preparations consistent with planning to disappear. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses, and none fully explains the complete absence of physical evidence. This lack of evidence is perhaps the most perplexing aspect of Brandon's case. Even in cases where bodies aren't recovered, investigators typically find some trace, clothing, personal effects, or signs of the person's passage. In Brandon's case, it's as if he simply vanished from the face of the earth after saying, "Oh, The impact. Brandon Swanson's disappearance has had ripple effects extending far beyond his immediate family. Most notably, it led to the passage of Brandon's Law in Minnesota, which changed how law enforcement responds to reports of missing adults. Prior to this legislation, police often waited 24 to 48 hours before investigating reports of missing adults, operating under the assumption that adults have the right to go missing if they choose to. Brandon's Law requires immediate preliminary investigation when the disappearance is out of character or potentially dangerous. For the community in western Minnesota, Brandon's case was a stark reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in the seemingly safe rural landscape they called home. Local residents who participated in searches or followed the case were confronted with the unsettling reality that someone could vanish completely just miles from their homes. Brandon's disappearance also served as a catalyst for increased awareness about the challenges of searching for missing persons in rural areas. The case highlighted how vast open spaces can be just as difficult to search effectively as dense urban environments, albeit for different reasons. The seemingly empty landscape of western Minnesota concealed Brandon as effectively as any crowded city might have. For search and rescue professionals, the Swanson case became an important study in the limitations of standard search techniques and the need for thorough, repeated examinations of areas where missing persons might be found. Some search experts have used lessons learned from Brandon's case to develop new protocols for rural searches. The family's enduring search. No one has felt the impact of Brandon's disappearance more profoundly than his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson. Their lives were irrevocably changed in the early morning hours of May 14, 2008, and they have lived in a state of suspended grief ever since, unable to fully mourn because there has been no resolution, no confirmation of death, no body to bury. In interviews over the years, the Swansons have spoken about the particular agony of not knowing what happened to their son. "It's a wound that never heals," Annette once told a reporter. "Every day you wake up and wonder if today will be the day you get answers." Brian and Annette channeled their pain into action, not only pushing for the legislation that became Brandon's Law, but also working with organizations that support families of missing persons. They have become reluctant experts in an area no parent ever wants to learn about: the painful limbo of having a missing child. The Swansons have maintained Brandon's room much as it was the day he disappeared, a physical space that embodies their suspended grief and enduring hope. They've commemorated birthdays and holidays, marking the passage of time without their son, but refusing to surrender to the idea that he might never be found. "We made a promise," Brian Swanson said on the 10-year anniversary of Brandon's disappearance. "We promised we'd never stop looking for him, never stop trying to find out what happened. That's a promise we intend to keep." The ongoing mystery. More than 15 years have passed since Brandon Swanson disappeared, and his case remains officially open. Law enforcement periodically reviews the evidence, and occasional searches still take place when new information emerges or when changing seasons alter the landscape enough to warrant another look. The area where Brandon disappeared has changed somewhat over the years. Fields have been plowed and replanted countless times. Vegetation has grown and died back with the passing seasons, and water levels in the Yellow Medicine River have risen and fallen. These changes have further complicated search efforts, potentially obscuring evidence that might have once been visible. Advanced technologies have been brought to bear on the case as they've become available. Drones with thermal imaging capabilities have surveyed the area from above. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to check for anomalies beneath the Earth's surface. Each new technology has offered hope, but so far, none has provided answers. Brandon's case has been featured on true crime podcasts, in documentary series, and on websites dedicated to missing persons cases. These platforms have kept his story alive in the public consciousness and occasionally generated new tips, though none have led to a breakthrough. The passage of time has not diminished the fundamental mystery at the heart of Brandon's disappearance. How could a young man vanish so completely in open country, leaving absolutely no trace behind? This question continues to haunt investigators, fascinate the public, and torment Brandon's family. The cruel paradox of rural disappearances. Brandon Swanson's case illustrates a cruel paradox of rural disappearances. In a landscape where visibility often extends for miles, where there are few places to hide, a person can still vanish without a trace. The very openness of rural Minnesota, its fields stretching to the horizon, its network of ditches and creeks, its scattered groves of trees, created not clarity, but confusion in the search for Brandon. This paradox extends to many aspects of the case. The Yellow Medicine River, which might have claimed Brandon's life, is in many places shallow enough to walk across, yet it could have concealed his body. The flat farmland that seems so easy to search contains countless microenvironments, culverts, ravines, abandoned structures that could hide a person or remains indefinitely. Even the timing contains paradoxical elements. Brandon disappeared during spring, when the landscape was becoming more accessible after winter, yet before the full growth of summer vegetation would make searching even more difficult. The clear night that allowed him to see lights from Porter also meant cold temperatures that could have accelerated hypothermia if he became wet or injured. Perhaps the most painful paradox for Brandon's family is that he vanished while connected to them, literally on the phone with his father. That connection, which might have saved him, instead became the final, tantalizing thread of contact before complete silence. Dan Swanson heard his son's last words, but could do nothing to prevent whatever happened next. Final reflections. In the quiet farmland of western Minnesota, where the horizon stretches endlessly and stars fill the night sky, a young man's fate remains written in question marks. Brandon Swanson's disappearance reminds us that even in our connected, surveilled modern world, it is still possible to vanish completely, leaving behind only questions and grief. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of our ability to find those who are lost. Despite all our technology, our search techniques, our investigative methods, and our determination, sometimes the answers remain elusive. Sometimes the earth itself becomes a keeper of secrets. For Brandon's family, each sunrise brings the same questions that have haunted them for more than 15 years. What happened after that final ocean? Where is their son? Will they ever know? For the rest of us, Brandon's story serves as a reminder of human fragility and the thin line between presence and absence. One moment, a young man was celebrating the completion of his classes, making plans for his future, living a life full of possibilities. The next moment, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but an echo of alarm in his father's memory. There is no neat resolution to offer here, no tidy conclusion that brings closure. Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains one of those mysteries that defies solution, that refuses to release its grip on our imagination and our sense of justice. His story continues to resonate because it touches on primal fears of being lost, of disappearing, of simply ceasing to exist without explanation or ceremony. Somewhere in western Minnesota, the answer to what happened to Brandon Swanson may be hidden in plain sight, in a field, beneath the surface of the Yellow Medicine River, or in the memory of someone who knows more than they've revealed. Until that answer is found, Brandon's case will remain open, his family will continue to search, and his disappearance will continue to remind us that some mysteries persist, challenging our understanding of a world we thought we had mapped, measured, and mastered. Subscribe to Noctivox, hit the bell, and join us every Saturday to uncover the hidden.